Hi everybody, and welcome to Bear Quilts Live. Today it's all about tips and techniques. My name is Reed Johnson and I am the designer behind Bear Quilts. And I use Accuquilt a lot when I am designing my quilts. And so today I'm going to show you 3 different techniques for using Accuquilt to cut out quilts. First technique will be appliqué. The second technique will be cutting out strips. And the third technique will be using Accuquilt to cut out geometric shapes, and then I'll show you how easy it is to sew it together. So let's get started. First of all, I'd like to show you one of our quilts that uses appliqué pieces, and this is called Dancing Bears. And you can see that it has little appliqué bears on it that were cut out by Accuquilt. And another quilt that we have that uses appliqué shapes is Where Are You? And in this one, down in the lower right hand corner or left hand corner, is a sheep, a black sheep that's saying Where Are You? And that's where the quilt got its name. So the die that we used for the bears is called Baby Baby, and you can see that it has like a bear shape. And this is what the die actually looks like. It has two-tone foam. The dark part is where the bear is actually cut out, and then the light is not cut out. And in between the two, there's a steel blade that actually does the cutting. So the way Accuquilt works is you take a die like this, you lay 6 layers of fabric on top of it, then you place a plastic mat on top of that, and you put it in the cutter, and as it goes through the cutter, there's a roller that pushes down on the mat and cuts the fabric. So we don't want to waste fabric, so a way to determine how much fabric we need is we take a clear ruler and use it to determine what size fabric we would need to cover the bear. So I determined that for this shape it was 4.5 inches. The other thing that's important when using Accuquilt to cut out shapes is that you want to run with the lengthwise grain parallel to the label that's on the side. So there's a label right here, and you want to run with the lengthwise grain parallel to that line. So in a normal piece of fabric, if this was cut off of a bolt of fabric, this is 16 inches, the fold is up here at the top, the selvage is down at the bottom. So the lengthwise grain is 16 inches of length as it's cut off the bolt. That's the lengthwise grain. The crosswise grain goes from selvage to selvage. Now the lengthwise grain doesn't have as much bias. The crosswise grain has more bias, and so it's stretchier. And that's why it's important that you have the fabric lined up so that the lengthwise grain is what's going through the roller. So on this particular die, we would lay the fabric on there like that so that it's going with the lengthwise grain. Now, oftentimes with appliqué pieces, you need a smaller piece of fabric. And so this fabric doesn't have a selvage or a fold for me to determine where the lengthwise and crosswise grain is. So I'm going to show you a tip how to determine that. I'm going to take my fingers and my thumb and my index finger and place it on either side, and I'm going to snap the fabric. And then I'm going to snap it the other direction. So do you hear how this is a lower sound? And then when I snap it this way, it's a higher sound. So the higher sound is the lengthwise grain. This is the lengthwise grain. So if I was going to use this fabric on this die, I would lay it this way so that I'm doing the lengthwise grain. But we're actually going to use black fabric or brown fabric to make our bears. And so you can lay 6 layers of fabric on the die, but in order to do appliqué, you need to have fusible webbing on the back. So I'm using heat and bond light. So the fabric counts as 1 layer, and heat and bond counts as a 2nd layer. So when I have 3 pieces of fabric with heat and bond on them, that would be your 6 layers of fabric. So we're going to take and carefully place those over the bear and make sure that it totally covers the bear. Then we're going to, if you want to save your mat, you don't have to cover the entire die, so you can just cover the part that you're cutting. So I'm going to place the mat over, and I'm going to take it and run it through this cutter, which is called the Go Big. This is the electric cutter. You notice that I don't have to be touching it at all, and it's running through the cutter. They also have a Go Big that has a crank, but this is the Go Big electric. So now once it comes out, there's static electricity that's created when it goes through the cutter. So to remove that, we want to give it a little love. And speaking of love, Blue Bear would love it if you gave him a little bit of love by hitting that love button, the like button, and share this video with your friend, because Blue Bear feels like everybody could use a little bit of love right now. So we've given this mat some love, and I'm going to slide the mat off. You slide it, which keeps the fabric in place, and then I'm going to peel these layers off, and you see I end up with perfectly cut out little applique bears. And then the heat and bond is on the back, and you would peel that off and then fuse it to your quilt. And you do the same thing with the other shapes that are on the die, like the bow tie and the eyes. You just cut out a piece of fabric that's the appropriate size and then run it through the cutter. Technique number 2 is going to be cutting out strips. And the quilt that's an example of that would be our Greek Isles modern quilt. And it was done with Hoffman Valley Batiks. The pattern calls for 2.5-inch strips, but the great thing about Accuquilt is that you can use other sizes. So the die that we're going to use today is the 1.5-inch die. And so by using that die, we would actually be able to make that quilt smaller. So to show you the die up close, you'll see that there are lines running down this way. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strips that are all going to get cut out at once. And then there is a 90-degree line down here at the bottom. There's a 30-degree line, a 45, and a 60-degree line. And I'll show you what that's used to cut in a little bit. And then there's also this straight line up here at the top, which that's what you're going to place the fold of your fabric on. Now, the one thing I said about running, here's where the label is, running the lengthwise grain, strips are the only exception to that. Because if I were to do that, I would get strips the length of the fabric as it came off the bolt, but I actually want strips that go from selvage to selvage. So strips are the only thing where you lay it on the die with a crosswise grain. So I'm going to lay it here, and I'm going to take my fabric and I'm going to fold it in half. So I now have 4 layers, and and the fold is up here at the top, and I'm going to take that fold and I'm going to lay it on that line at the top that I told you about, and then I'm going to make sure that the fabric is covering all of the cutting lines so that I don't miss anything. So I've got it all lined up on there. I'm going to take and put the mat on, and I'm going to run it through the cutter. So one thing that Accuquilt has that keeps your dies nice and clean is a die care pick. And this looks like a dental cleaning pick, and it keeps your dies nice and clean. It will help you pick out the threads that get caught between the steel blades and the foam. So now it's come out of the cutter. We're going to give it a little bit of love. Slide the mat off. And then you see how we get perfectly cut 1.5-inch strips. And there's 5 of them at one time, and if I had laid more layers on there, we'd have even more. The other thing is, you know how oftentimes when you use a rotary cutter and you get, well actually I did get 2 because I folded it in half. You oftentimes will get like a bow at the where the fold is, and see, I'm not getting any bow. That's one great thing about using Accuquilt to cut out your strips. So now, as I told you, it can be used to cut out other things. So I'm going to take and lay one of the strips I just cut on the 90-degree line, and I can fold it back because I can have up to 6 layers. And then I'm going to take and lay one on the 30-degree line. So you can see what that looks like. Now I'm going to take the mat and lay it on there and run it through the cutter. So another tip I have for you is, do you ever get like lots of little fuzzy things from cutting batting or fusible batting on your rotary cutting mat? Well, this rotary cutting mat stone, this one is called Tri-Sharp. When you rub it over the mat, it'll remove all of those little fuzzy things, and it'll kind of restore your mat, and it'll prolong the life of your mat. So now we run this through. We're going to give the die some love again, give the mat some love, slide this off, and you'll notice that now we have perfectly little 1.5-inch squares that are cut out. And we also have, we laid that on the 30-degree line, so we have perfect 30-degree diamonds that have been cut out. So this die of these strip dies are very useful for being able to cut out strips, squares, and diamonds of different angles. Now, technique number 3 is cutting out geometric shapes, and the shape that we're going to be cutting out is the half square triangle, and the quilt that is an example of that is our Kings and Queens quilt. This fabric was made with QT fabrics, and speaking of QT fabrics, I have a collection of fabrics that is coming out with QT fabrics in June, I believe, and it is inspired by authentic 1920s fabric. And I believe it'll be in stores in December or January. So if you'd like to be made aware when this type of fabric will be available, please go to my website at www.bluebearquilts.com and sign up to receive my newsletter. The shape that we're going to be cutting out that's in the block for that particular pattern is the half square triangle shape. Now in the quilt, it happens to be a 12-inch block, and so the half square triangle is half of that block, which is 6 inches. But the great thing about Accuquilt, once again, is that you can make the quilt in a different size. So instead of making that quilt in a 12-inch block, you can make it in an 8-inch block with the 8-inch cube. The cube contains 8 different dies, and there is a 4-inch square, a 2-inch square, a 4-inch half square triangle, and a 4-inch quarter square triangle, and also other shapes like a square on point, a parallelogram, a rectangle. So this cube will allow you to convert blocks to other sizes, and it also creates all these different blocks, over 72 different blocks, by having this one cube. So instead of using the 6-inch half square triangle, we're going to be using the 4-inch half square triangle today, 4.5 unfinished. And so this is what the die looks like. And you can see that it has notches right here, and it has a line, so you're actually going to be cutting out 2 shapes at a time. And so when I lay 6 layers of fabric on there, you're actually going to get 6 half square triangle units in one pass. It also has the notches, where the notches have been cut out, and that's so that when you sew it together, you won't have any dog ears. And also, if you sew from this point right down to this point, you will have a perfect 1/4-inch seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take, and you could lay 6 layers, but I'm going to lay 2, and I'm going to lay a black piece of fabric and a green piece of fabric right sides together, so that when I cut this, they're going to be ready to pick off of there and start sewing. So again, we give it a little love. Don't forget to give Blue Bear that love and likes and shares. So I peel that off, and notice how these pieces are perfectly cut out, and I can just take them right off of here, and they're ready to sew. And then once I've sewn it, I've sewn from this point to this point, and by doing that I get a perfect 1/4-inch seam, and when you press to the dark, you end up with a very nice 4.5-inch unfinished half square triangle. Now, one other thing that you can do with this die is that oftentimes you want to miter your border pieces, your sashing, and your binding strips. So these are 2.5 inch strips. And by taking and placing them right here on the corner of that notch and making sure that this right edge is lined up here, we're then going to take the mat and we're going to place it only partially on the die. Whoops, it slipped on me. Like that. Place it partially on the die. And we want to make sure that we're not cutting down here. So the mat is not covering that part. So now I'm going to take this and run it through the cutter. And you'll see that I have a perfect 45-degree miter on these pieces. And when I take and turn them like this, I'm able to match it up like this. And notice how it creates that 45-degree angle that you normally have when you're sewing binding strips together. And then again, you sew from this point to the other point, get a perfect 1/4 inch seam, and when you open it up, you'll have a perfectly straight binding strip sashing border. So I hope you've enjoyed these 3 techniques that I've shared today with you about Accuquilt and cutting out the various shapes. Coming up next is Tammy Silvers with Tamarini Quilts. She and Cherry were organizers of this great event, and so I'm sure she'll tell you more about the event and also have some great tips for you. Thank you so much for watching, and Blue Bear and I say bye-bye for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.